Sometimes, as much as you want to love a series, it just doesn't work out. At face value, Takt Destiny really felt like a love letter to composers and classical music, and it had such an interesting creation behind it. You had Oji Hiroi, who of course is known for doing Sakura Wars, was the writer behind it. You had both Mappa and Madhouse working simultaneously on each episode. Everything behind it and the presentation itself seemed really interesting, and the animation was just top notch. But kind of mixed in the middle of there is one core issue, the issue that kind of faces a lot of series like this, the multimedia project. While despite having all these things laying out for it that seem kind of interesting and almost like an experiment, that thread that keeps pulling it towards the middle that always seems to ruin a lot of series was there. What exactly was the reason for the show? That's what we're going to kind of get into with this review of Takt Destiny, a 12-episode series that aired in the fall 2021 anime season. So let's jump into it. Takt Destiny opens up pretty much in America. It seems like at some point this big meteor struck the Earth, and then following that, a second meteor struck the Earth. And what kind of came from these meteors is an invasion. These things that mankind call D2s. And these D2s seem to be drawn to sounds that humans make. It bothers them. But even worse so is music. And so quickly as mankind is trying to survive, they're trying to survive against these D2s, they eventually abolish all music to keep music out of the ears of the D2s and thus kind of quell the attacks. Well, mankind isn't without its own tools to work against the D2s, and these tools come from those such meteors, which is the music arts. And these music arts are girls that are able to fight against the D2s, and they work alongside somebody who they call a composer. And these composers are able to give them energy and thus instruct them in battle. No, it's not Fate Stay Night. And as the story opens up, we follow a guy named Takt Asahina. And starting out, he's a pianist that is basically just working in his garage, just playing piano all day. And he's taken care of by two girls, Anna and Cosette. And these two girls were asked by his family to take care of him in the absence of his father, who was killed by a D2. And Cosette really loves Takt's music, enough that she wants other people to experience it. So while the Symphonia, which is this group that essentially employs the music arts to protect the people from the D2s, is holding an event where they're allowing music to be played, she drags Takt out of his garage by stealing his piano and puts it at this event so that he can play his music there. And while they're enjoying their time, they get attacked by the D2s, and the both of them are critically wounded. Well, oddly enough, Cosette awakens as Destiny, one of these music arts, completely wiping out her previous personality. And this is where we find out the music arts are actually girls that have given up their life to become a music art. They give up their entire identity and everything they was before to become one of these music arts. So it's tragic, obviously, to her sister Anna and Takt, as they'll never have Cosette back. But there's still one little thread of hope. If they could possibly bring her to New York where they have this headquarters, they may be able to do something for them. So thus begins this kind of adventure, this cross-country adventure where they run into different cultures of humans that still remain, fight against different D2s they end up facing, and ultimately struggle with both the loss of music in the world and the loss of Cosette and what she once was. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a show that I really wanted to love. I'm a fan of classical music. Now, I'm not a fan in a way of I know all the music, I know the names, I know all the meaning behind it, but enough that I love the music itself and I have a passion for it. So when I hear it, especially being used in an anime, it's definitely something I enjoy. And it does seem like the creators themselves had a passion for the music as well, as you see a lot of people that are coming out talking about how every song that is used within this show, and there's a deep meaning behind them and how they're used in the show itself. So it's one of those things that if you're a really huge classical music fan, you're probably going to find a lot of really interesting uses in the show itself. Well, even people like me that love to listen to classical music and anybody else is probably just going to miss it completely. But it is interesting that there's a passion there, that there's a concerted effort to utilize music in a way of telling a story along with the show itself. And obviously there's a lot of effort in the animation as well, as you have two really big studios, Madhouse and Mappa, that are working on this project. Now at the same time, I will say that despite this, there was a lot of cases where I felt like the animation was kind of lacking. When you have two really big studios that almost seem like they're trying to have a little contest with each other, there's a lot of cases where I'm like, wait, that was it? Like, this is what you're doing? There was cases where a lot of the character art and animation just kind of clash with each other, and you have these points where it just feels like the animation itself is lacking and the characters look kind of stiff, which is a huge surprise to me when it seems like this is something that seemed like it had a good budget behind it. There's still really amazing points in the show itself, but there's a lot of really points too, like points where you're just like, that didn't look good. And that gets to the core of the show itself, the enjoyment, the story itself, and this is where I really struggle. When the show opened up, my big thing that I was kind of taking from the first few episodes was that I had an inkling that the story wasn't going to be there. I assumed that based on what they were presenting so far, this really isn't going to go anywhere. The story itself isn't going to give me much. But I had a hope. There was a chemistry there. You had Takt, who's kind of a very stern, doesn't want anybody to bother him kind of character. You had Destiny, who is what Cassette turns into, who's just trying to discover things. She's very robotic. She's very bland in her emotions. Everything is for a purpose, and for the most part, it's to eat. She's found something that she enjoys, and that is to eat. So she wants to discover things. And then you have Anna, who is a sister of Cassette, who's kind of the mother, the one that kind of keeps everybody together and keeps them focused on what they need to do. And so you have these clashes of personality that are constantly at each other, while at the same time the D2s show up and they fight against those. And within the first few episodes, I really liked it. You had this great chemistry to show us the current time, and you had this really fantastic backstory that was pretty emotional, but then it never really does anything with it. The chemistry doesn't really do anything, it doesn't evolve, and it doesn't really, again, do much with that chemistry. Instead, a lot of the focus kind of comes around each of these groups of people that they end up running into along their way to New York that really isn't all that interesting. The characters don't really advance much except for Cassette. You kind of see this element of Destiny trying to be a replacement for this girl that was lost, and that feeling that everybody is just treating her like Cassette even though she is now Destiny, and that lack of her own identity becoming somewhat of a story beat at some point. Anna's obviously always struggling with the fact that she lost her sister, but she still thinks her sister's there. And Takt is just a jerk. He's just sitting there grumbling every 2 seconds, not wanting anybody to bother him. But thankfully there was one beacon of hope throughout the entirety of the series all the way up into the end, and that was Lenny and Titan. Lenny and Titan were great. They were kind of the personality and the character that I kind of wanted from the other characters. Lenny had a story. Lenny had a driving force, and Titan was just fun. And it was funny to have this kind of contrast between when they were there and when they weren't there. The show was just so much more entertaining when Lenny and Titan were there. It made you realize just how kind of bland Takt and his team were. And that was the real struggle that I had. As much as I wanted to enjoy this cast, it just wasn't there. And I think a lot of my frustration was around Takt. He was a jerk, and he was really annoying to be around. He was unbearable. His whole personality was to tell people to be quiet, and that's not entertaining at all. And you expect that there would be a growth in his character over time, but it doesn't really happen until the very end. Suddenly out of nowhere, Takt has this emotional outburst, and he grows as a character, sort of. And don't get me started on the overall story. The overarching story just wasn't there. It seemed like in the first few episodes, you already knew what was happening. You already knew who was behind the scenes. You knew who was basically puppeting the entire thing. There was no mystery here for the story. So like I said, the driving force should have been the characters, because obviously the overarching story wasn't really there. There was no real story there. There was no meat to really dig into. All the story was pretty much obvious at the very beginning and kind of unfolded at the very end, and it wasn't very satisfying. So the characters had to be the driving force, and there wasn't really much character there besides Cassette, Lenny, and Titan. And it really did seem like at some point, while pretty much they started throwing so many characters on the screen, that it kind of reminded us what the show was. This show was a prologue to the mobile game. Even so much that after the show ended, they released a trailer for the mobile game that's supposed to come out, and the opening segment of that trailer is the ending segment of the show. This was a big, huge welcome to our mobile game show, which is unfortunate. I think we kind of knew that this was going to be a mixed media project from the very beginning, but there was a hope having such a prolific group behind it that they would do something with this show itself, not just make it a trailer. And like I said, I don't think they pulled that off, because a majority of the show was, is Cassette a character? Is Cassette Destiny? Is Destiny her own person? How can she kind of fill this gap, this missing person they no longer have? And I don't think they pulled that off, because it was so focused on just these different stories that weren't all that interesting. These civilizations that they ran into, these groups of people that had their own music that they couldn't have, and the history of Takt himself and his father. So in the end, it's a very difficult show for me to sell to people. I think if you were like a super diehard music fan, classical music specifically, you might find dissecting the songs they use each fight to be interesting. If you're just looking for some, crazy animation points, there's a few of them in there. But in the end, I think it just turns into a show that's just kind of a throw on and don't really think too much about it and just watch some action scenes and some goofy interactions. There isn't really too much here to really sell people on. But I do think it was an interesting experiment, I guess, in the end, to have two different studios working on the same project, some decent characters, and some crazy action points. That's my thoughts on Takt Opus Destiny. Definitely let me know down below if it's something that you enjoy or if it's something you're going to check out. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video if you can. Support us on Patreon through the tips link in the description below. Definitely appreciate everybody that does, and y'all take care.